November 29, 1941, 7:15 a.m. United States Department of State, Washington, D.C. Dorothy Edgers, 57, adjusted her bifocal reading glasses on her nose as her practiced fingers typed yet another intelligence report translated from Japanese. Her gray hair, pulled back into a neat bun she'd kept since her days as a secretary at a Boston law firm 28 years ago, reflected the soft light from the desk lamp. Dorothy was not a diplomat. She was not a college-educated intelligence analyst. She was not a soldier. She was a widow who had taught herself Japanese for 15 years because her late husband, a silk merchant, had done business in Tokyo, and she always followed his conversations with fascination. When the war in China began in 1937, Dorothy offered her translation services to the government for $20 a week, a third of what she earned as an executive secretary. Now his hands, calloused from decades of typing commercial contracts, shook slightly as he read the intercept he had just translated. The document, captured by the Navy's signals intelligence system at Pearl Harbor 3 days earlier, was a Japanese diplomatic communication using ciphered language that Dorothy, with her intuitive understanding of Japanese cultural nuances, had decoded in 40 minutes. Young military cryptographers, trained in advanced mathematics and code theory, had worked on the same document for 2 days without success. Dorothy understood why she didn't just see numbers and patterns. She saw culture, context, the subtleties of a language she had studied not in classrooms, but in real conversations with traders, in letters exchanged with Japanese friends in years of practical immersion. The message she translated was clear and terrifying. It spoke of coordinated naval operations, aircraft carrier movement, windows of opportunity based on lunar phases and meteorological conditions. It specifically mentioned Pearl Harbor using a code name that Dorothy recognized because she had heard her husband use the same poetic metaphor years earlier when describing the harbor as pearls in a blue shell. She stamped the document urgent, placed it in a red envelope designated for the immediate attention of senior officials, and walked on her arthritic legs through the halls of the State Department to the office of the intelligence officer in charge. Around her, dozens of other middle-aged women, former secretaries, retired teachers, librarians, housewives who had studied foreign languages as a hobby or necessity, worked silently translating mountains of intercepts that arrived daily from listening stations around the Pacific. These were women the government paid minimum wages, who wore no uniforms, who had no official security classification beyond their basic identification cards, but who processed 80% of all Japanese-related signals intelligence because true fluency in Japanese was rare among American military personnel, and these ordinary women had decades of practical experience that no military school could quickly replicate. 3 days earlier, November 26, 1941, 2,300 kilometers across the Pacific, Imperial Japanese Combined Fleet Headquarters, Hitokapu Bay, Kuril Islands. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, 57 years old, a 36-year veteran of naval service, a Harvard graduate, a former naval attaché in Washington who knew the United States better than any other senior Japanese officer, read the final intelligence reports before the history-changing operation. Yamamoto never wanted this war. He had warned the high command that attacking the United States was awakening a sleeping giant, but orders were orders, and now his Kido Butai, a task force of 6 aircraft carriers carrying 423 aircraft, was ready to sail in absolute radio silence towards Pearl Harbor. What troubled Yamamoto as he smoked his 10th cigarette of the morning was not the operation itself, meticulously planned for 11 months, but his own intelligence officer's reports on communications security. Lieutenant Commander Suguru Suzuki, a 42-year-old Cambridge-trained cryptography expert who spoke fluent English, had prepared a classified assessment that Yamamoto kept locked in his personal safe. Suzuki's report was devastating in its honesty. It systematically analyzed every Japanese diplomatic transmission over the past 6 months and concluded that Japanese diplomatic codes, different from operational naval codes, remained secret. UROs were probably compromised. Suzuki wrote with unsettling precision that Americans, known for their technical capabilities and industrial resources, had certainly established a network of intercept stations and probably employed civilian translators fluent in Japanese, possibly expatriates or academics, to process massive volumes of diplomatic traffic. He estimated that up to 40% of Japanese diplomatic communications could be being read in Washington, with a delay of just 24 to 72 hours. Yamamoto had taken this report personally to the Vice Minister of the Navy, Admiral Shimada, 49 years old, who read it, put it back in the folder, and said coolly that diplomats were responsible for their own communications, and the Imperial Navy would not interfere in foreign ministry matters. The institutional arrogance was complete. Foreign ministry officials, many trained in international law and classical diplomacy, considered it impossible for Americans to understand subtleties of the Japanese language, especially the formal language levels used in high-level diplomatic communications. Ambassador Kichisaburo Nomura in Washington, 63 years old, had personally reported that he had seen no evidence that Americans had competent Japanese translators, much less people capable of understanding the cultural nuances necessary to decode encrypted diplomatic language. This assumption was about to cost Japan any chance of real strategic surprise. Yamamoto crushed his cigarette and authorized navigation order. Kido Butai would leave Hitokapu in 36 hours for a point of attack that Japanese diplomats in Washington had inadvertently revealed in at least 17 different communications that Dorothy Edgers and her colleagues had already translated, cataloged, and filed away in red folders that now gathered dust in State Department offices as bureaucrats debated protocols for distributing sensitive intelligence. December 1st, 1941, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Office of Naval Intelligence, Navy Department Building, Washington, D.C. Captain Alwyn Kramer, 43 years old, an intelligence officer with 16 years of service and responsible for distributing decoded intercepts to senior officers, looked at the growing pile of translations prepared by Dorothy Edgers and her team of 17 other civilian translators. Over the past 2 weeks, this group of women between 50 and 68 years of age had processed 143 Japanese diplomatic documents, 32 of which contained direct or indirect references to military preparations, fleet movements, and operational schedules. Kramer had no doubts about the quality of the translations. Dorothy Edgers specifically had proven her competence time and time again, often capturing nuances that younger military translators, trained in accelerated 9-month programs, completely missed. The problem wasn't translation, it was distribution. Security protocol required that top-secret intelligence be distributed only to a specific list of 17 senior officers and civil servants, each of whom must read documents in person, sign a reading log, and return documents immediately for destruction. This system, designed for maximum security, created an absurd operational bottleneck. It took an average of 5 to 7 days for a single document to circulate to all authorized recipients. Many senior officers were frequently in meetings, traveling, or simply unavailable. Some documents never completed the distribution circuit before becoming obsolete. Kramer had proposed 3 times to expand the distribution list and implement a system of dedicated couriers to guarantee reading within 24 hours. Their proposals were denied due to security concerns. Senior officials argued that each additional person with access posed a potential leak risk. Irony was cruel. Japanese mistakenly assumed codes were secure when Americans routinely read them. Americans, successfully reading Japanese codes, applied such restrictive security to the resulting intelligence that information never reached people who could act on it. Dorothy Edgers had translated a message on November 29th at 10 in the morning, warning of coordinated naval operations with veiled references to Pearl Harbor. This translation arrived at Kramer's desk at 2 o'clock in the afternoon of the same day. Kramer placed it in the distribution folder immediately. The portfolio first went to Secretary of State Cordell Hull, 69 years old, who was meeting with the British ambassador and was unable to review it until 28 hours later. Then it went to Secretary of War Henry Stimson, 74, who read it quickly but interpreted it as another indication of rising tensions, not warning of an imminent attack. He went to Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Harold Stark, 61 years old, who was in a strategic planning meeting for operations in the Atlantic and did not see the document until 3 days later. Each delay, compounded by bureaucratic procedures designed to protect secrets, created a situation where secrets became useless due to obsolescence. Kramer looked at the calendar. 1st of December. If historical processing patterns continued, Dorothy's translation of November 29th would not complete the distribution circuit until December 8th or 9th. By then, any window for action would have closed. December 3rd, 1941, 9 o'clock in the morning, Marine Signal Intercept Station, Fort Ward, Bainbridge Island, Washington. Ralph Briggs, 63, a former commercial telegraph operator with 41 years of experience listening to Morse code on commercial lines, merchant ships, and now Japanese military traffic, removed his headphones and massaged his tired temples. Briggs was an anomaly in the military. A civilian contract technician, he earned $65 a month, less than private seamen. But his ability to identify patterns in radio traffic was legendary among his younger colleagues. Briggs didn't just copy Morse code. He listened to rhythm, timing, transmission patterns. After 4 decades, he could identify individual operators by their unique code-sending characteristics, what radio operators called fists, a signature as unique as handwriting. Over the past 72 hours, Briggs had noticed something deeply disturbing. Japanese naval radio traffic, which normally followed predictable patterns, had changed dramatically. Not volume, but quality. Operators Briggs recognized from years of interception, identified by their distinctive fists, suddenly vanished into thin air. New operators, with different patterns, appeared on secondary frequencies. Most significantly, Briggs detected what he called ghosts, very short transmissions, often just test groups or procedural checks coming from unexpected locations. These ghosts lasted only seconds, not enough time for accurate triangulation, but enough time for Briggs to realize that stations that should have been in known Japanese ports were transmitting from oceanic positions. He prepared a detailed 23-page report documenting every anomaly, every pattern change, every ghost. His report concluded that the Imperial Japanese Navy was clearly carrying out sophisticated radio deception operations, using secondary transmitters in ports to simulate the presence of ships that were probably at sea under absolute radio silence. Briggs couldn't prove the fate of these ships, but his instinct, honed by 4 decades of listening to communications, told him something big was happening. He delivered his report to his supervisor, Lieutenant J.G. Frederick Hart, 26 years old, recent graduate in electrical engineering who had completed a 4-month course in signals intelligence. Hart read the report, took notes, and thanked Briggs. Then placed report in your outbox labeled low priority for consolidation with other technical reports into weekly summary report. Hart, trained in standard procedures, did not understand that Briggs was reporting not routine technical data, but fundamental change in enemy operational behavior. For Hart, the 23-page report on individual radio operators' wrist characteristics was technically fascinating, but lacking operational urgency. Briggs's report was consolidated with 47 other technical reports into a 162-page document that was dispatched via regular mail to the Office of Naval Intelligence in Washington, where it would arrive in 5 to 7 days. In the meantime, Briggs continued listening. On December 4th, he detected another anomaly. Absolute radio silence from all frequencies associated with Japanese aircraft carriers. Not traffic reduction, but complete silence. Not even routine maintenance broadcasts or equipment tests that normally occurred daily. Briggs reported it immediately. Hart wrote it down. Nothing happened. December 5th, 1941, 11 o'clock in the morning, Office of the Secretary of State, Washington, D.C. Dorothy Edgers personally delivered another urgent translation. This one was particularly disturbing, a Japanese diplomatic message that instructed ambassadors in Washington to be prepared to deliver a formal note of very serious warning. The short, possibly just an hour or two in advance. The message used language that Dorothy recognized as formally associated with declarations of war or the severing of diplomatic relations. She had attached an explanatory note detailing cultural context and historical precedents. His translation included not just words but implications, nuances that only someone with a deep understanding of Japanese diplomatic culture could capture. Dorothy delivered directly to Maxwell Hamilton, 53 years old, chief of the State Department's Division of Far Eastern Affairs. Hamilton read it, asked questions about specific nuances, and thanked Dorothy profusely. Then he placed the document in a folder for Secretary Hull. Hull was meeting with senators on issues of American neutrality in the Atlantic and would not be available until late in the evening. Hamilton considered interrupting the meeting but decided against it. Protocol dictated that only the Secretary of State could determine whether specific intelligence justified interrupting a meeting with members of Congress. Document remained in folder. Dorothy returned to her desk and continued translating. She and her colleagues were now working 12 to 14-hour days, 6 days a week, processing increasing volumes of Japanese diplomatic traffic. They all perceived increasing urgency in communications. Language became more formal, more circumspect, exactly the type of language that preceded serious diplomatic ruptures. Grace Morrison, 59, a former Japanese teacher at a private school in Boston, who had studied in Kyoto for 3 years in the 1920s, commented during a coffee break that recent messages were reminiscent of communications that preceded the breakdown of relations between Japan and China in 1937. She had translated those messages too, working for the Asian Studies Department at Harvard. The patterns were eerily similar. Grace mentioned this in a report she prepared as analytical context. His report was filed as supplemental historical analysis, a category that did not require urgent distribution. Margaret Chen, 61, born in San Francisco to Chinese parents who fled the Boxer Rebellion, fluent in Japanese out of business necessity when the family operated an import business before the Great Depression, translated a message on December 6th that specifically mentioned Sunday as a significant day. Language was oblique, but Margaret, with decades of experience in commercial communications where timing was crucial, understood the implication. Sunday the 7th of December was mentioned not explicitly, but through references to the lunar calendar and context that made the date clear to any culturally informed reader. Margaret included a detailed explanatory note. His translation arrived at the State Department at 4 in the afternoon on Friday, December 6th. It arrived too late for regular distribution. It was placed in a pile for processing on Monday, December 9th. None of the officials who could have prioritized reviewed it over the weekend. Washington operated at a different pace on weekends. Many senior officers maintained the tradition of leaving the Capitol on Friday night and returning on Monday morning. Urgent intelligence accumulated until Monday, unless someone specifically mandated emergency distribution. No one determined it, because officials responsible for making that determination had not seen translations that would justify such action. It was a perfect bureaucratic cycle of failure. December 6, 1941, 7 o'clock at night, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Commander Edwin Layton, 41, Pacific Fleet intelligence officer, reviewed stacks of reports arriving daily from Washington. Layton was one of the few senior naval officers fluent in Japanese, having served as a naval attaché in Tokyo and studied language and culture extensively. He relied heavily on signals intelligence but was frustrated by the quality and timing of information he received. Reports arrived in fragments, often days or weeks late, rarely with adequate context. Layton did not have direct access to translations by Dorothy Edgers and her team. He received only executive summaries prepared by intelligence officials in Washington who consolidated multiple sources into overall assessments. These assessments, by necessity, omitted specific details that could identify sources and collection methods. The result was technically accurate but operationally vague intelligence. Layton knew that tensions with Japan were escalating. Everyone knew. But knowing that war was likely and knowing when and where the next attack would happen were completely different matters. That night, Layton had dinner with Admiral Husband Kimmel, 50 years old, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, and General Walter Short, 61 years old, Commander of the Hawaiian Department of the Army. Conversation revolved, as it often did in those tense days at the end of 1941, about what Japan would do next. Kimmel expressed frustration with Washington, complaining that intelligence he received was simultaneously alarming and non-actionable. They knew Japan was moving toward something, but Washington wouldn't say where or when. Short agreed. He had received warning 2 weeks earlier about possible sabotage by the local Japanese population and had implemented security measures against sabotage, including concentrating aircraft in compact groups to facilitate surveillance. This measure, designed to prevent sabotage, created perfect targets for air attack, but no one in Hawaii had been specifically warned that air attack on Pearl Harbor was a real possibility. Warning from Washington had focused on possible Japanese operations in Southeast Asia, the Philippines, possibly Guam. Pearl Harbor, 7,000 kilometers away from Japanese-controlled territory, seemed unlikely as a target for a coordinated attack. This assumption was shared by most senior officials in Washington and Hawaii. It was based on established naval doctrine that carrier operations across oceanic distances were extremely risky and unlikely, capable of being attempted against a fortified base. Doctrine was about to be demonstrated to be catastrophically outdated. That same night, 1,500 miles north of Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto's Kido Butai sailed in absolute silence through stormy seas toward a launch point 300 miles north of Oahu. 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, 3 submarines, and 8 tankers moved in battle formation through rarely used sea lanes, taking advantage of storms that kept skies covered and visibility reduced. The fleet had maintained absolute radio silence since leaving Hitokapu on November 26th, just as Ralph Briggs had detected at his intercept stations. But Briggs's report had not yet reached Washington, and even when it did, it would take days to process, analyze, and distribute. December 7th, 1941, 3:45 in the morning, Washington time, 10:45 in the morning, Pearl Harbor time. Dorothy Edgers was home, sleeping after working until midnight on Saturday processing a backlog of interceptions. She did not know that the final Japanese diplomatic message, containing the 14 points of the formal declaration of severance of relations, was being transmitted at that moment from Tokyo to the Japanese embassy in Washington. She didn't know that this message would be intercepted by Navy listening stations and that someone would have to translate it. Grace Morrison, on duty that Sunday morning on a newly established emergency rotation due to increasing volume, received an intercept at 6:15 in the morning. It was a long message, divided into 14 parts, each part needing to be translated with absolute precision because it was clearly a formal document of extreme importance. Grace, working alone in a nearly empty State Department office on a Sunday morning, began translating. His hands, arthritic from decades of typing, moved as fast as possible. She completed translating the first 13 parts at 8:30 in the morning. The 14th part, containing critical instructions to deliver a message to the Secretary of State at precisely 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Washington time, arrived at 9:20. Grace translated in 15 minutes. She immediately understood significance. 1 o'clock in the afternoon in Washington was 7:30 in the morning in Hawaii. Why would the Japanese specify such precise timing if it wasn't going to coordinate with a military operation? Grace tried to contact supervisors. It was Sunday. Home phones were unanswered or busy. She finally caught up with Maxwell Hamilton at 9:55. Hamilton said he would try to locate Secretary Hull immediately. Grace sat in her office alone, looking at her translation, knowing something terrible was about to happen, but unable to do more than wait for someone in authority to act in time. At 10:50, Washington time, 5:50 Pearl Harbor time, Captain Kramer finally received a complete translation from Grace. He immediately began an emergency distribution circuit, trying to locate all officers on the distribution list by Sunday morning. Many were not available. Some were in churches, others in country houses without telephones. Secretary Hull was located at 11:15. He read the message at 11:40. He immediately understood that Japan was about to attack somewhere, but the message did not specify where. He tried to contact President Roosevelt. Roosevelt was in a meeting that could not be interrupted for another 30 minutes. It was 11:55 in the morning in Washington. It was 6:25 in the morning at Pearl Harbor. First wave of 183 Japanese aircraft was 20 minutes away from Oahu. December 7, 1941, 6:45 in the morning, Pearl Harbor. Sky was clear, morning was calm. It was Sunday, the lowest operational readiness day of the week. Many sailors were sleeping after Saturday night's leave. Warships were anchored on Battleship Row in tight formation, perfect for inspection, but also perfect for coordinated air attack. Aircraft were grouped together at airfields to protect against sabotage, completely exposed to bombing. Operational radars at remote stations detected the approach of a large formation of aircraft at 6:45. Radar operators reported contact. Officer on duty, Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, 28 years old with little experience, assumed that 17 American B-bombers were expected from California. He told radar operators not to worry. At 7:48 in the morning, Commander Logan Ramsey, watching from the control tower on Ford Island, saw the aircraft dive over Pearl Harbor and release a torpedo. For a brief moment, he thought it was an extremely realistic exercise. Then he saw the symbol of the rising sun on the wings. He took the microphone and transmitted a message that would change history. Air raid. Pearl Harbor. This is not drill. Pearl Harbor air attack. This is not drill. In Washington, it was 12:48 in the afternoon. Secretary Hull was finally receiving Japanese ambassadors Nomura and Kurusu, who arrived an hour late to deliver a message they should have delivered at 13 o'clock, before the attack began. The delay was caused because the Japanese embassy's typist, not entrusting such a sensitive message to hired American typists, was personally typing all 14 pages. He was not a professional typist, and the process took hours. When ambassadors finally delivered the message, Hull already knew about the attack. He read the message with controlled fury and told the ambassadors that in all his 50 years of public service, he had never seen a document so full of falsehoods and distortions. Ambassadors left. War had begun not with a formal declaration followed by hostilities as international protocol required, but with a surprise attack followed by a delayed declaration. Japan had deliberately attempted to coordinate a declaration of war to arrive an hour before the attack, maintaining technical appearance of compliance with international law while ensuring maximum effect of surprise. Embassy bureaucratic error ruined even this facade. But a bigger mistake was assuming that diplomatic messages were safe when Dorothy Edgers and her colleagues had been reading every word for months. Intelligence was there. Warnings were there. Every piece of the puzzle had been collected, translated, reported. Ralph Briggs had detected radio anomalies indicating fleet movement. Dorothy Edgers had translated references to Pearl Harbor. Grace Morrison had identified historical patterns. Margaret Chen had noted the significance of Sunday the 7th of December. But the system designed to protect top-secret intelligence had created so many layers of security, procedure, and bureaucracy that information never reached people who could have acted. December 8, 1941, 10 o'clock in the morning, Office of Naval Intelligence, Washington. Captain Kramer sat at his desk, surrounded by stacks of translations that Dorothy Edgers and team had prepared in the previous weeks. He methodically reviewed every document, every notice, every indication. It was all there. Communication of November 29th on coordinated operations. Failed references to Pearl Harbor translated by Dorothy that military officials had interpreted as metaphors with no operational meaning. Grace's analysis of diplomatic patterns preceding conflict. Briggs' detection of radio anomalies indicating fleet movement under radio silence. Margaret's message on Sunday's significance. Precise timing instruction for delivery of declaration at 13 o'clock that clearly coordinated with military operation. Each individual piece was a fragment of intelligence processed correctly, translated competently, reported appropriately. Collectively, they formed a clear picture of preparations for the attack on Pearl Harbor. But no one had put all the pieces together, because the system was not designed for synthesis, but for compartmentalization. Dorothy Edgers translated but did not have access to radio interception reports. Ralph Briggs reported radio anomalies, but had no access to diplomatic translations. Grace Morrison analyzed historical patterns but was not authorized to access current operational intelligence. Intelligence analysts in Washington compiled summaries, but worked with days of delays due to security procedures. Commanders at Pearl Harbor received general warnings but not specific actionable information, because Washington feared compromising sources by revealing precise details of interception capabilities. The result was systemic failure, where each component of the intelligence system functioned adequately, but the system as a whole failed catastrophically. Kramer began preparing a post-attack report, analyzing what went wrong. His report would eventually grow to 240 pages and conclude that the fundamental problem was not a lack of intelligence, but a lack of coordination, synthesis, and timely distribution. He would recommend comprehensive reforms, including establishing a centralized analysis center, where all types of intelligence would be consolidated and analyzed by multidisciplinary teams, with the authority to issue urgent assessments directly to operational commanders. These reforms would eventually lead to the creation of the CIA and modern intelligence fusion centers. But by December 1941, they were too late. Pearl Harbor had been attacked. 2,403 Americans were dead. 1,178 were injured. 8 battleships damaged or sunk. 188 aircraft destroyed. And all this despite warnings. December 10, 1941, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Department of State. Dorothy Edgers sat at her desk, exhausted after 48 almost continuous hours of translating declarations of war, diplomatic communications, and the avalanche of traffic that followed the attack. She hadn't slept since Saturday morning. His hands shook not just from arthritis, but from emotional exhaustion. Dorothy knew with absolute certainty that she had translated enough warnings. She had done her job. She had identified the threats, captured the nuances, explained the cultural context. And it hadn't been enough. Not because his translations were inadequate, but because the system that should have used his translations to prevent disaster was so bogged down in procedure and compartmentalization that vital information never reached its final destination in time. She thought of dead sailors at Pearl Harbor, young boys of 18, 19, 20, who never knew attack warnings existed, translated by a 57-year-old woman in a Washington office they would never meet. Grace Morrison entered the office carrying coffee. She placed the cup on Dorothy's desk without speaking. They both knew. There were no suitable words. They had tried. They had done everything they could do within their roles, and it had been insufficient not because of their fault, but because of the fault of the system that employed them. Margaret Chen joined them. 3 middle-aged women, former secretaries and teachers, sat in a quiet office drinking bad coffee while processing the fact that they had predicted Pearl Harbor, and no one had listened. In the following days, investigations began. Committees were formed. Blame was distributed. Admiral Kimmel and General Short were relieved of command and eventually retired, carrying the burden of failure that was as much or more Washington's as theirs. But the real culprits were not people, but the system. System that valued secrecy over dissemination. System that created so many procedures to protect sources that intelligence derived from sources became operationally useless. System that did not rely on integration and synthesis because each agency, each department, jealously protected its own information. Dorothy Edgers never testified at public hearings. She was a low-level civilian whose existence was classified. Grace Morrison was never called upon to explain her analyses of historical patterns. Ralph Briggs never explained to congressional committees what his detections of radio anomalies meant. They were invisible cogs in the intelligence machine, people whose work was so secret that even when the system failed, their contributions remained hidden. May 1943, 18 months after Pearl Harbor, the same State Department, transformed. Dorothy Edgers, now 59, supervised an expanded team of 42 translators. Complete reform of intelligence distribution procedures had been implemented after Pearl Harbor. Now, urgent translations went directly to a newly created Intelligence Analysis Center, where analysts from multiple agencies worked side by side, sharing information in real time. The operations room was open 24 hours a day. Liaison officers from the Navy, Army, State Department, and FBI worked together. When Dorothy completed an urgent translation, she herself walked to the operating room and personally delivered it to the analyst on duty, explaining nuances and context. System still far from perfect, but incomparably better than the pre-Pearl Harbor bureaucratic labyrinth. Dorothy and her colleagues now had access to intelligence from multiple sources. They saw not just diplomatic messages, but operational context. They could tell whether specific terminology in diplomatic messages corresponded to known movements of Japanese forces. His translations were more valuable because they were informed by broader context. And perhaps most importantly, their contributions were recognized. In March 1943, Dorothy received the Meritorious Civilian Service Award, one of the first civilian women to receive such an honor. Ceremony was small and classified, but recognition meant everything. Award presenting officer, Rear Admiral Joseph Redman, 51, Director of Naval Communications, said that Dorothy and her team's work had saved countless lives by providing timely warning of multiple Japanese operations including Midway, Guadalcanal, and submarine operations. He didn't mention Pearl Harbor. It didn't need to. Everyone in the room knew. Grace Morrison, 61, received similar recognition. Ralph Briggs, 65, received a rare civilian promotion and substantial pay increase after his work detecting movements of the Japanese fleet before Midway saved American carriers from ambush. Sistema was learning that practical experience, intuition based on decades of work, and in-depth knowledge of language and culture were worth as much or more than youth, formal academic training, and military rank. Margaret Chen, 63, established a training program where older translators taught younger recruits not just Japanese language but cultural context, history, diplomatic nuances that could not be learned from textbooks. Program produced a generation of intelligence analysts who understood that effective translation required not only linguistic competence but deep cultural understanding. In Tokyo, Admiral Yamamoto faced bitter reality. Pearl Harbor had been a tactical success, but a strategic failure. The United States was not paralyzed. He did not ask for peace. Instead, he became enraged and mobilized with determination that Yamamoto had predicted, but hoped to avoid, with a decisive knockout blow. Worse still, Yamamoto now knew for certain that Japanese diplomatic codes had been compromised all along. Japanese military intelligence, analyzing intercepted American communications after Midway, had concluded that Americans had much more sophisticated code-reading capabilities than anyone had imagined. Naval codes were changed, but damage was done. Years of diplomatic communications had been read by Dorothy Edgers and her colleagues, providing American analysts with in-depth understanding of Japanese decision-making processes, relations between military and civilian leadership, strategy debates, everything. Ironically, warnings that could have predicted Pearl Harbor were ignored, but intelligence derived from the same interception and translation system became crucial to subsequent American victories. System learned, adapted, improved. But learning cost more than 2,000 American lives and years of war that potentially could have been avoided or shortened if warnings had been heeded in December 1941, August 1945, days after the Japanese surrender. Dorothy Edgers, 61, translated the last document of her wartime service. It was a message from Emperor Hirohito, accepting terms of surrender. Dorothy read carefully chosen words, formal in the extreme, charged with the weight of national defeat. She thought of 4 years of war, millions of dead, incomprehensible destruction. He thought about Pearl Harbor and what could have been different if the system had worked. He thought of all the young men who had died, American and Japanese, because arrogance, bureaucracy, and miscommunication had rendered warnings useless. But she also thought about victories that had been possible because the system eventually improved. Midway won because intelligence was shared quickly. Japanese submarine operations were anticipated because translations were distributed efficiently. Fleet movements detected because analysts had access to multiple intelligence sources simultaneously. War could have ended months or even years earlier if the system worked optimally from the beginning, but at least the system learned. Dorothy submitted retirement in September 1945. She returned to Boston, to her modest home, to the quiet life she had left 4 years earlier. She has never spoken publicly about her service. Work remained classified for decades. Neighbors only knew that Dorothy had worked for the government during the war doing something with documents. They did not know that she had read Japan's most sensitive secrets, had translated Pearl Harbor warnings, had contributed to victory with quiet competence that never received the public recognition it deserved. Grace Morrison returned to teach Japanese at a small university in Massachusetts. Her students never knew that their elderly teacher had been a crucial intelligence analyst. Ralph Briggs retired for good, content to finally rest his 68 years of resting his ears that had listened to tens of thousands of hours of Morse code, detecting invisible patterns that saved lives. Margaret Chen opened a small bookstore specializing in Asian literature in San Francisco. She occasionally hired young veterans returning from the Pacific to work at the store, never mentioning that she had read intelligence that helped bring them back alive. December 1966, 25 years after Pearl Harbor. Dorothy Edgers, 82 years old with completely white hair, hands marked by severe arthritis but still sharp mind, attended the memorial dedication ceremony at Pearl Harbor. She had not been to Hawaii since the war but decided to make a final trip, using modest savings accumulated during retirement. Ceremony was emotional. Survivors, many now in their 60s, returned to honor fallen comrades. Speeches were made about sacrifice, heroism, vigilance, but no one mentioned warnings. No one talked about unheard translations, unread reports, undisclosed intelligence. Official story remained focused on surprise attack, Japanese treachery, innocent victims. Dorothy knew the truth was more complicated. It was not simply a surprise attack when the American government had been reading Japanese intentions for months. It wasn't simply treason when warnings about timing and targeting existed. It was a systematic, institutional, human failure to process and act on available information. After the ceremony, Dorothy visited the Arizona Memorial, built on the sunken hull of the USS Arizona, where 1,177 sailors remained buried. She stood alone on the floating white structure looking at water still stained with oil slowly leaking from the sunken ship 25 years earlier. She thought of each of those young boys, sleeping on a quiet Sunday morning, never knowing that notices about their fate existed in offices in Washington. He thought about his own small but real role in the tragedy. She had done everything right and had fallen short. It wasn't his fault personally, but the weight of knowledge still weighed down. A young memorial guide, a Navy veteran in his early 20s, noticed an elderly woman standing alone for a long time. He approached her politely and asked if she was okay. Dorothy turned, eyes wet. "Yes," she said, just remembering. The well-intentioned young man said that she must have been a child when the attack happened. Dorothy smiled sadly. "In fact," she said carefully, "I worked for the government during the war." "Doing what?" the young man asked. "Translation," Dorothy said. "Translation only. Nothing as important as what these men did." The young man thanked him for his service and walked away. Dorothy stayed a few more minutes. So he left, carrying secrets he would never fully tell, knowing that recorded history would never include the contributions of Dorothy Edgers, Grace Morrison, Ralph Briggs, Margaret Chen, and hundreds of other elderly civilians whose life experience, practical skills, and quiet competence had been so crucial, but would remain forever unsung, except by the few who knew the truth and took them with them to their graves. War had ended 21 years earlier. But for Dorothy, for Pearl Harbor survivors, for families of the dead, war never really ended. It simply became part of the permanent past, shaping present and future in ways most would never fully understand. And the most important lesson, the one that Pearl Harbor should have taught but was repeatedly forgotten, remained simple and bitter. Having warnings was not enough if the system failed to listen, process, and act. Intelligence without action was simply wasted knowledge, and wasted knowledge cost lives that could never be recovered.